Simply put, knowing one's own culture is a first step, but it won't amount too much unless one also possesses information about the cultural groups. In this lesson, you will learn about this, and after going through the module, you shall be able to understand the phenomena of cultural orientation in international business, explain the concepts of emic and etic, differentiate between emic and etic, analyze the dilemma between emic and etic approach, suggest measures to overcome the dilemma. Introduction. Now I will give a brief introduction of module. How culture can be measured has always been a fundamental challenge for scholars in the field of international business. Whether European, African or Asian, we feel that people from other cultures act differently in many life contexts than we do. We may have different problems and we may think differently about the same problems. Are those other people so different from us that it is impossible to make comparison between cultures, or are there beneath the mask of the threatening stranger or the fascinating exotic lies the same deep structures, that is, the same abilities and needs? These are the fundamental questions addressed by cross-cultural approach. Given the subjective nature of cultural inquiry, emic and etic perspectives play an important role. The terms emic and etic were first coined by the linguistic theoretician Kenneth Pike in 1954. These two approaches to understand human behavior lies under the study of cultural anthropology. Cultural anthropology states that people are shaped by their cultures and subcultures. In the environmental approaches as well as context relating to culture, national culture and dimensional culture are the major concern. Now, we will consider the phenomena of cultural orientation in international business. There were more than 160 definitions of culture in the 1960s compiled by A.L. Kroeber and C. Kluckhorn. The existence of numerous definitions implies that every scholar may view culture from different angles. The point is that different elements are collected when the concepts of culture are defined. In this context, Lung Tan Lu has observed that it is difficult to say that any single definition can be satisfied because language has limitations in describing abstract concepts of culture. Thus, it is better to assume that culture is an aggregate of numerous elements. Through the lens of culture, human beings learn to view, perceive, and relate to the world. Cultural differences are important factors that result in differing perceptions, ideas, and indulgence. This being the reason that we experience cultural shock while traveling, we sense bewildered, confused, and is inclined to make mistakes. We have to appreciate these cultural obstacles and avoid coming to flawed conclusions. The phenomena of cultural orientations approach combines the theoretical concept with the practical understanding of the influence of culture and the significance of cultural capability, which allows people to purposely reduce risk, enhance innovation, and maximize opportunities as they adjust to new environments and different conditions. By combining the two approaches of emic and etic, one gets the broad view of a culture or society. The cultural orientations approach can be applied to the various levels of human organization and interaction at which culture operates. One can think of such 6 levels of culture which are given below. First, functional culture. Second, identity group culture. Third, individual culture. Fourth, national societal culture. Fifth, organizational culture. And sixth, team culture. The moral of this discussion is that culture being a crucial factor in international business, which makes it important to reconcile cultural differences for successful negotiation. There exist 4 major models for identifying international differences in culture. They are as under. First, Cultural orientations are based on 5 dimensions of A. Time, B. Space, C. Things, D. Friendships, and E. Agreements. This is developed by anthropologist Edward T. Hall. Second, Cluckhorn and Strodbeck identified a framework of cultural orientations consisting of A. Relation to nature, B. Relationships among people, C. Mode of human activity, D. Belief about basic human nature, E. Orientation to time, and F. Use of space with variations in each one. Third, Hofstede identified that cultural values have 5 major dimensions, which are A. Individualism, collectivism, B. Power distance, C. Uncertainty avoidance, D. Masculinity, femininity, and E. Confusion dynamism or long-term orientation. Fourth, Trompinars and Hemden-Turner extended Hofstede's framework and identified 7 dimensions, which are A. Universalism versus particularism, B. Collectivism versus individualism, C. Affective versus neutral relationships, D. Specificity versus diffuseness, E. Achievement versus ascription, F. Orientation toward time, and G. Internal versus external control. In the previous slide, we described different dimensional frameworks illustrate different and overlapping approaches to organize the many complex dimensions that make up culture. However, these provide a map to logically apprehend the complex nature of culture. One has to keep an important fact in mind that each framework is not exhaustive and each one is derived from a specific cultural perspective. This makes essential for managers to have proper understanding of cross-cultural nuances to enrich cross-cultural intelligence and competence. In the words of Dinah J. Wong Mingji, in many ways, how a society addresses issues of multiculturalism creates an orientation that enables its citizens to live and work together in a global community. Cultural norms that are shaped by national government policies needs to avoid and dismantle policies for separation, keeping different cultural identities but not integrated or assimilation. Forced rejection of traditional cultural identity to integrate into dominant identity in order to adopt new methods of multiculturalism. Important principles for multicultural policies center on endorsing tolerance and cultural understanding to respect diversity, recognize multiple identities, and build common bonds of membership to the local community. Now we will first consider the concept of emic. Emic is concerned with one single culture to understand culture-specific behavior. The point to be noted is that the behavior through the eyes of the people who live in that culture becomes an important aspect of understanding. The term emic relates to or involving analysis of cultural phenomena from the perspective of one who participates in the culture being studied. It conveys an understanding of thinking of native residents, how the local people observe and classify the world and the norms of their behavior, what meaning they perceive from them, and in what way they visualize and explain things. The emic culture is influenced by local belief, conventions, and customs. Whenever we try to understand culture-specific behaviors, emic approach is followed as it is concerned with studying one culture alone. The concept of emic emphasizes the culture and the meaning it has in the culture through the way it is linked to cultural behavior of local people. It highlights the norms, values, motives, and customs of the members of the culture as they interpret and understand it themselves. Culture-bound syndrome is a culture-specific disorder that can only be understood within a specific cultural context. As for example, among the Yoruba people of West Africa, it is believed that spirits might come into the possession of one's soul and that person can be treated by spells by a medicine man or a healer. To understand one's cultural bias, it is important to know the region to which people belong to. It is important to understand that members of a culture are habitually very much involved in what they are doing to interpret their cultures impartially. Now, we will look at concept of ethic. Ethic compares psychological phenomena across cultures to discover universal behaviors. It aims at comparing and contrasting behaviors across cultures to discover whether the behavior is culture specific or universal. From the ethic outlook, one takes an external viewpoint of a culture. The term ethic explains that an outsider belief is important about others' culture. In this way, one looks how an outsider focuses on local observations, categories, explanations, and interpretations. Ethic understanding points out to generalizations about human behavior that are considered universally true and commonly links cultural practices to factors of interest to an outsider, the observer. The outside observer may look at factors such as economic or natural conditions which cultural insiders may not consider very relevant. This is sometimes characterized as scientific way of thinking. Ethic is considered with psychological phenomena across cultures to find out what might be universal in human behaviors. Its objective is to compare and contrast cultural phenomena across cultures to investigate whether phenomena are culture specific or universal. The cultures to which people belong to influences the way that they perceive themselves and their successes. America and the Western countries promote individualism, while Asian countries such as India, Japan, etc. value collectivism and modesty. The origin of the terms emic and etic goes back to 1954 when linguist anthropologist Kenneth Paike coined these terms. These two terms have been derived from the linguistic terms phonomics and phonetics. This describes the dichotomy in all languages between the perceived alphabet in the mind of the native speakers and the actual sounds that they articulate when they speak. It is worth to remember that Paike and others subsequently broadened the application of emic and etic to all aspects of human behavior in culture, not simply language. Until now, we have considered the concept of etic and emic separately. Now, we will consider distinction between emic and etic. Emic and etic are two approaches of research. As you are aware, an emic approach gives an insider view and emphasizes how people within one culture think, perceive, and understand their race. This approach provides the description which carries great weight to the person within that culture. The etic approach is based on common remarks that are implicit and applied across cultures. This will be the way to distinguish between insider and outsider view. In the real world, one should not think of emic versus etic as a dichotomy, not mutually exclusive. Both of them can be used in varying degrees. It is good to remember that the real strength lies in integrating the two. An emic approach is preferable for studying a particular culture in detail to capture how that specific society perceives, act, or experience a product or service. On the other hand, an etic approach is useful as it enables to compare and contrast across multiple cultures which are contextually different, having different populations. This provides the vision to build up wider cross-cultural themes and concepts. The success of this approach ultimately depends on the objectives and insights one wants to achieve. In any kind of comparison between emic and etic, the trouble arises when one assumes equivalence. It must be noted that grocery shopping is one thing, but grocery shopping behavior across cultures widely differs. The point is that grocery shopping could mean very different things and involve very different behaviors from one culture to another. Even in the present era of globalization, it is not justifiable to think that just because we are becoming more integrated, our differences are less. In fact, one would justifiably say that because of such enhanced integration, differences are becoming more evident. There are some debate among scholars regarding the comparison between emic and etic. Accordingly, some scholars assign preference to the emic at the expense of the etic. According to famous anthropologist Marvin Harris, one's goal should be to understand human behaviors and not to determine what the insider might mean by their beliefs or actions, but instead to discern explanations for why it is that they do or think what they do. This is because Harris is interested in identifying the influence of the material factors like political or economic which form the background of human behaviors and beliefs. Russell T. McCutcheon has synthesized different views on the comparative analysis of emic and etic approach. Clifford Geertz argues that one shall not take polar opposites position involving an either or position. Instead, he aims simply to interpret and understand what it is that someone might mean when they say or do this or that. Integration of emic and etic approach. The integration of emic-etic approach will be advantageous at various points to manage cultural diversity. Such advantages are: first, combines insights from both traditions. Second, avoids limitations of both etic and emic judgments. Third, better understanding and conceptualization of culture. Fourth, facilitates capturing of its various influences on reasoning. And fifth, provides benefits to research activities in international business. The point is that etic approach is helpful for making comparative analysis. However, such comparative analysis requires corroboration from fieldwork which will provide new elements collected by an emic approach. Today, most cultural anthropologists agree that anthropological research should gather both emic and etic knowledge. Emic knowledge is indispensable for the intuitive and empathetic understanding of a culture, and also for conducting effective ethnographic fieldwork. It should be noted that understanding of emic is generally an important source to frame etic hypotheses. In the similar manner, understanding of etic will help in making cross-cultural comparisons. Such comparisons are necessary for ethnology because they need standard units and categories. The moral is that both etic and emic approaches have their limitations. The emic approach is based on a model of self-determination. The individual is seen as a self-determined being acting within a cultural framework whose actions are susceptible to self-reflection. The emic approach entails two kinds of dangers: systematic bias and arbitrariness. The etic approach is based upon a model of static influence. These weaknesses in both the etic and the emic approaches indicate the necessity for an integrative approach. Morris et al. Argue that the etic and emic approaches are complementary. Greenfield suggests that the emic approach serves best in exploratory research, but the etic approach serves best in testing hypotheses. Lung Tan Lu has suggested that one should conquer neither etic nor emic perspectives are superior and may combine etic and emic approaches in cross-cultural study. The moral of this discussion may well be concluded in the words of Carl J. Franklin. Emic and etic are two ways to view the same thing, resulting in two ways to describe it, providing a stereoscopic window on the world. The detached observer has one view, the native participant has another, but both are necessary. The outside observer is attempting to understand the inside viewpoint, and as he does so, he moves back and forth from the objective etic categories that he has been trained to utilize to a subjective understanding of what the categories mean, their emic nature. The etic view is alien, cross-cultural, prepared in advance as a typological grid, somewhat absolute, often measurable, created by the analyst, while the emic view is domestic, monocultural, structurally derived, relative, and contrastive in reference to a system and discovered by the analyst. Now we will consider the dilemma between emic and etic approach. The concept of dilemma. According to James J. Jacquard et al., the difficulty in obtaining observations that are both adequate within cultural description of a phenomena and that are cross-culturally comparable has come to be described as the emic-etic dilemma. The cross-cultural dynamics has its origin in the dilemma between emic and etic approach. Scholars have argued that in place of having meanings and beliefs of a particular insider group, the emic perspective, it is desirable to have factors associated with those meanings and beliefs. Basically, emic and etic approaches are not conflicting, and depending on the situation, one may be given priority to the exclusion of the other. It is widely recognized in anthropological study that the emic and etic approaches complements each other. Headland found that authors equate emic and etic with verbal versus non-verbal, or as subjective knowledge versus scientific knowledge, or as good versus bad, or as ideal behavior versus actual behavior, or as description versus theory, or as private versus public, or as ethnographic versus ethnological. Such kind of description about emic and etic creates confusion surrounding these terms. Despite acknowledging both emic and etic approaches, the emic approach continues to be more important in understanding a particular culture. The reason behind such thinking is that in reality, it is not possible to accurately realize and understand the intricacies of a particular culture. To understand the intricacies, one has to be an inhabitant of that culture. The etic approach will not be able to have complete understanding of the culture which inherently lies within that culture. Given the very nature of psychological subjectivity of the culture, it is not easy to have past experiences, ideas, and outlooks by following the emic approach only. In the same way, it is hazardous to follow only etic approach because of perils involved in ignoring the nuances, meanings, and concepts inherently lies in a particular culture. One should not think of emic and etic as two separate phenomena. They both form part of an understanding. As such, it is very fruitful to know the differences in understanding of two participants. One belongs to emic school and the other comes from etic school. This is the reason that Yin has asserted that personal characteristics such as age, gender, sexual orientation, race, and ethnicity can play a significant role in the divergence between emic and etic views on the same subject, even in cases where a real-world event is being described. In this situation, it is advisable to maintain a sound balance between emic and etic approaches because of the inherently subjective nature of all human experience, which leads to the divergence between insider and outsider views. One must be aware that in the very nature of things, such divergence will always exist. There is no cultural universality and there exists cultural relativism. Given the context, it is important to remember the following. Does universality in human behavior exist? Does relationship exist between cultural norms, values, and attitudes? How does the cultural diversity manifest in human behavior? The emic approach to studying human culture is one in which the members of the culture being studied are the main source of information used to understand the culture. Jessica Whitmore likes to link the M in emic to the idea that the actual members of a culture are the most important source of information when studying that culture. For ethics outsider approach, she prefers to link the T in ethic to the word theories, as this approach has at its foundation in the use of pre-existing theories. In fact, those who employ this method argue that it makes them more able to identify cultural traits that exist cross-culturally. However, opponents of this approach argue that this outside observation can tend to lead to mistaken conclusions and generalizations about specific cultures. Some scholars have presented solutions to this dilemma between emic and etic. One such approach is known as the physiodotic approach, which is considered methodologically the least defensible by James J. Jacquard et al. French and Trenides et al. Have presented a methodologically more defensible solution to the etic-emic dilemma. They have developed a combined etic-emic approach consisting of 3 stages of inquiry. In such studies, factor analysis has been used in the identification of etic constructs, factors consisting of emic elements. Let's summarize the discussion we have done so far. It is a common knowledge that across societies, cultural differences prevail. Given this reality, we must deal with these differences by learning to understand the 2 important terms that are usually applied in the cultural context. These 2 terms are etic and emic. Learning more about emic and etic approaches can be helpful to appreciate the cultural diversity. The human behavior through the eyes of culture may be seen from the emic or etic point of view. Looking at culture as an insider is emic. Looking as an outsider is etic. Emic is an insider view of a culture, etic is an outsider view of a culture. Emic and etic are technical terms commonly used by the linguist. Pike derived the term etic from the suffix of the word phonetic, which pertains to the study of sounds which are universally used in human language. Similarly, emic stems from the word phonemic, which is primarily concerned with the acoustic, external properties and meanings of words. An etic test is applied outside of the culture in which it was created, relies on vocabulary. Someone from another culture might have the same vocabulary usage as used to create the test, even if they speak the same language. But with regional differences, emic testing would then be applied within cultural or regional context so as to resolve problems in their own right. An emic amount comes from a person within the culture. Emic testing is deliberately based on a culture, and assessment would presumably have to be with issues pertaining to that culture. The emic approach is culture specific because it focuses on a single culture and it is understood on its own terms. Almost anything that comes from within a culture provides an emic description. An etic version is culturally neutral, limiting any ethnocentric, political and/or cultural bias. International business research with cultural issues would benefit from combining the etic and emic approaches. Etic approach, which examines common elements of cultures and state hypotheses, may be useful for comparative analysis but need corroboration from fieldwork and must be open to new elements collected by an emic approach. For better understanding of cultural differences, both emic and etic approaches should be combined together. Thank you.